live? We'll wait. Probably people are scrambling a little bit, so we'll give them a couple minutes. Well, it'll take a few minutes to get connected. We're now live. Yeah, that's around it. There's a point where it stops clicking, but I think you can turn it back down just a touch. And sometimes you have to turn it up to get it to stop clicking. I think you can turn it down quite, a little bit. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Let's do it then. Morning, everyone. Sorry for the short delay, technical difficulties. Back in the old day when the computers first came on, it was called disk boot failure. You got disk boot failure. So, but we're live and good morning. So we'll meditate in a few minutes, but something very amazing happened last night. You'll remember that we were talking yesterday about on page 9. You don't have to go back to it, but I was talking about that in order to really use our own capacity to choose our state, that really it was really about the freeing ourselves from fear, doubt, and the need to control. And the first thing we were discussing was choosing love and loving our life. And I said at the time that non-dual tantric practices emphasis is on bliss, and if you will, the power of that bliss, and what gets expressed from that, using the powers of will, knowledge, and action, the divine powers of will, knowledge, and action. And I was saying that there isn't a lot of reference within the Trika, within the non-dual Trika tradition, talking about love. And yet we all know what love is. We had a discussion about that. So last night through the Wizard of Oz Facebook, there proceeded to be a discussion, a posting by our friend Christopher Wallace, or Harish, who is truly a great tantric scholar and practitioner. Been a practitioner for most of his life. And so he made a post that was pretty amazing. And I'll read what he said, because Christopher is a person who, I mean, he does an amazing work. And really every day he's doing some other discussion of a different text, etc. The site is called Tantric Yoga Now, I believe. Yeah, it's beautiful. Go there. But he made this statement. It was one of those memes where it was in big letters, and it kind of got your attention. He says, "OMG, I'm so excited. We finally found an exact textual citation for the teaching that this whole universe arises from love." Now that got my attention, as it should, and certainly based on our conversations yesterday. So there's a text that he has been exploring, along with a man named Ben Williams, who works closely with him, is a translator, scholar, etc. So we certainly have to give credit to Ben and to Chris. So it appears that this particular citation was from our friend Abhinavagupta, one of our heroes in this life. Abhinavagupta was an extraordinary tantric master. He was the person who took a number of the different traditions that had and were emerging in his lifetime and before. He lived in the 11th century, and he garnered them all together and expressed them using the term trika. Trika means try, it means three. There are many great scholars studying this. These are texts that were not available 30, 40 years ago even, right? Anyway, Abhinavagupta was truly a spiritual genius, we'll call it that. So he had done the Tantra Loka, which most of you know about, which is Abhinavagupta's opus, 10 bazillion pages long, right? Still only partially translated. Harish is doing some work on it. Mark Duskovsky, as Alexis Sanderson, other people. But it is the Bible, if you will, of Trika philosophy. So it's wonderful to see it coming out. One of the key texts that Abhinavagupta used to in his creation, if you will, of the Tantra Loka, was a text that was much older than that, called Malini Vijaya Tatra. I don't want to cite the date because I'm not confident that I know. I keep thinking 8th century, but that could be wrong. So particularly all you date nerds out there, forgive me. Right? Sorry, Bhairava. So it turns out that this particular citation was found in a commentary on that Malini's Vidya Tantra, and the text is called the Malini Shloka Varchaka. Excuse me for butchering that. Another person, Jason Schwartz, who's part of that whole community of scholars and practitioners, said in this thread of discussion that it appears to be an old Marathi, 12th century text. Marathi is one of the dialects of in India. He says, I've never seen anything remotely similar in the Kannada, not Canada, right, scripture. almost much of the ancient scripture was written in the Kannada scripture. So it was interesting, but what he's saying about it is that this particular text appears from his introspection about it to be from around the 12th century. But here's the quote that they put it, and I'm sure they'll continue to unpack this, and we'll be grateful to hear there. So I'm going to read it. I'll give you a little bit of just my first hit about it. I'll leave it to them to do a stronger discourse about it. Again, this is something that was written by Abhinavagupta. There was also discussion. They weren't sure if it was a direct quote from this text, even though they believe it was, but it could have been a paraphrasing by Abhinavagupta. We don't really care. What we care is what it says, which relates to the discussion we were having. It reads, possessing the central power, replete with the flood of all the feeling states existing within, beautiful with the universal joy arising from essence, nature, stimulated by innate desire, beautiful with the nectar of complete creative emission, vibrating eternally. That is the union of Shiva and Shakti. It's called love. Possessing the central power. Consciousness is the central power. Replete with the flood of all the feeling states existing within it. All experience exists within that central power. Beautiful with the universal joy arising from the essence nature stimulated by innate desire. Innate desire, the divine will to express that beautiful joy, that universal joy. Beautiful with the nectar of complete creative emission. Emission, the visarga means emission. It is the expression, the emission of that joy into manifestation, the emission of that joy into you, the emission of that joy that expresses you, vibrating eternally. This is the union of Shiva and Shakti. This is the union, they're saying, of consciousness and energy. And it's called love. Wow. Holy Kundalini. That's all I can say. I do look forward to their continuing to unpack this. And this was just one phrase in this particular text. OMG, Chris found this yesterday. It wasn't like, he's been holding on this for years and waiting for this moment that the world needs to hear it. Well, maybe. Maybe the world needed to hear it at this moment, right? So it'll be interesting to see as they unpack this phrase and subsequent phrases, whether there's a further distinction about that. But it was amazing because, as I said yesterday, and I am not a scholar of tantric tradition. I don't read Sanskrit, etc. So I certainly have no capacity to explore these texts. I'm grateful to be that people like Chris and Mark and Alexis and Ben, people have that capacity and are doing amazing work to bring it to bear. So all I can do is look at what they're expressing, and then try to which is what I've done with all my study of Scripture, try to understand my own experience through the discussion of Scripture. Or the other thing which Scripture allows us to do is points us to the possibility, if you will, of an understanding. Either way, there is what I call the nexus of knowing. Tantric tradition talks about this triadic dynamic of how we come to understand, to experience, to create the place in us that the revelation of pure consciousness can emerge. And we'll go into that in much detail, but that nexus of knowing that I call it, I believe in the Tantra Sara, I think again in Chris's book there's some discussion about it. But it says that there are three means, overarching fundamental ways in which we as individuals come to know the truth. Now that's overarched, or that is what happens after one thing takes place. The first thing that happens is grace. What's called Shaktipata, descent of grace, meaning that what happens for all of us, and we can all probably, if we're all on Zoom, we could share all our individual experiences of how we came to want to know God, how this longing arises. Well, through all their sophisticated data analysis, these ancient tantrics figured out that there were different levels of this grace, right? But the important thing that they were helping to understand, based on their own experience, etc., was that the longing to know God is God calling us home. What's called Shaktipada, right? The descent of grace. Now, immediately you could start to say, wait a minute. I thought you said there was only one thing. There was only pure consciousness. How is it that there's descent of God into me? Well, we can talk about this because of two reasons. One is God. He can do anything he wants. He makes the impossible possible. If he wants to be above you and descend into you, fine. Who's going to argue with him, right? And who cares, right? But mostly I want you to understand that descent of grace is consciousness descending into its own contracted state. Consciousness, God, descending into us, into our individual consciousness, and waking us up. So it's, if you will, God descending into himself. This is what you can understand, how that is not a dualistic concept. It is not some God above us that grants us or denies us, right? It is the God within us that descends from within its own unbounded consciousness into the aspect of our bound consciousness and wakes us up. And what happens because of that grace is the very response to that is called longing. What Rudy called the wish to grow. The longing to know God. The longing to know ourself. When that happens, then that longing compels us to find the support to allow that longing to expand. That support is called a teacher. That support is that consciousness calling back to itself the Shakti, the energy that it needs to fuel its own awakening. I said to you sometime in the last several days of our discussion, this time just seems to go away, right? That our class, this open eyes transmission, is consciousness doubling back on itself. Consciousness calling forth to itself its very own power, its very own energy, in order to fuel its own awakening. How incredible. How incredible that we, as individuals, have that possibility and that happening in our lives. But the point being is that whatever the particular teaching or teacher that this longing compels us to find, it is that consciousness in us that's compelling us to find the energy to fuel our own growth. Now, we could immediately say, wait a minute, stop. You're talking about I got to go find some teacher outside of myself to get this energy? Can't I just be my own guru? Well, good luck. Right. We can get lost in the idea that that's some dualistic dynamic taking place, or we can understand that energy source, that source of love, that source of nourishment, that source of support that we are calling forth back to ourselves is not happening outside of ourselves any more than we're happening outside of God. But one of the really interesting discussions about this, I am going to get to the triadic nexus of knowing, right, is that one of the more subtle ways that this discussion of Shaktipat is happening, and this is a discussion I had with my friend and scriptural mentor, I guess you would call him that, Mark Duskovsky. Wow. Was that he further elaborated that Shaktipada means the transmission of Rudra Shakti. Rudra is another name for God. And that because God's smart and he figured out that these individual ants running around on the planet can't quite figure things out on their own, right? That Rudra Shakti, which is God's power to liberate, it is the power that's transmitted to provide the energy for that longing to flower, to blossom. And that Rudra Shakti manifests through an embodied person. That Rudra Shakti manifests through an individual that we can come face to face with, heart to heart with, open eyes to open eyes with, through a camera, whatever, right? And this further reinforces that there's two, but there's actually only one. That the two-ness exists within the oneness. And it's amazing when you start to really penetrate and understand that. that it is penetrating through the experience of duality that brings us to the experience of unity. It's not a denial of duality. It's not a discussion of that duality is Maya, illusion. It is the penetration through the apparent experience of duality to find the unified field in which two things are happening at once, or 2 million things, or 2 billion things are happening at once. How amazing. So the point being is that this Rudra Shakti is the transmission of energy, the transmission of love, the transmission of nourishment that is we're calling forth from within ourselves, because this longing, which is God calling us back home within us, is calling to itself the very dynamic energy that it needs to what? To expand consciousness. Here it says, it is the union of Shiva and Shakti. So, the reason I got on that orange crate for a few minutes, I could tell you my story about the longing that happened for me. What happened to me when I was 19, living in West Texas, where there was no such thing as longing, except there was no longing for God in that barren desert. I'll put it that way. And out of nowhere, this thing happened. The reason that this is an important discussion, have a teacher, don't have a teacher, find a teacher, get rid of your teacher, find another teacher. This is not some discussion I'm having like that. I met my teacher in 1971. He lives in me every day. As I've stated before, it is by Shiva's grace that I was brought to Rudy. It's by Rudy's grace that I was brought back to Shiva. I never forget that. Not only do I not forget it, I live in it, I honor it, I express it to the best of my ability. There are discussions within the Tantric tradition that one cannot be liberated without a teacher. Enough said. But this nexus of knowing, right, has this triadic loop that basically says there are 3 requirements or 3 necessities for us to discover our own true, what do they call it, essence nature. And that's a teacher, scripture, and direct experience. And that depending on, if you will, at once the intensity of grace, the state of our of realization or revelation that took place because of that intensity of grace, one of those may have a prominent role for us. And that role, that continuous loop circle may actually rotate and change, right? Direct experience, of course, is our own meditation, our own turning our awareness inside, making contact with our essence nature. And then therefore all the practices are the tools that White Eagle suggested we all had, the tools to do that. And that direct experience is fundamental to our own realization. But this tradition also says to us that there are two other interchanging dynamics with that bring us to that direct experience, or helps us to understand our direct experience, i.e. scripture or a teacher, or can actually provide energy into that direct experience, i.e. transmission, right? You can understand, okay, I could sit here, people could sit here and expound scripture to you all day. And in some ways, it would be meaningless if what's being suggested there, the insight that's being revealed, doesn't become our own experience. But as I think somebody asked a question about it yesterday, how do we use content, right? That's how we use it. That it can at least suggest two things. A, that we're full of shit, that what we think we know it may not be as valid as we think, and that there's some other valid interpretation of our experience that we might want to look for, right? And that's kind of a ping pong back and forth, right? Scripture also is Shakti. There is energy embedded in word. And so, whatever scripture you want to study, don't want to study, right, that's fine. I'm not... the first 20 plus years of my practice, I studied nothing. For two reasons. One, Rudy was profoundly allergic to studying scripture for a couple of reasons. You have to remember that this was that last part of his life came after the hippie days. It came after the hippie days where all of us hippies started to gravitate towards being spiritual, right? We all started chanting and this and that, and I'm not saying anything about chanting because it's real, but Rudy once says, yeah, all these people are running around the streets chanting like cows. The point being that there was not real scripture available, at least that he gravitated toward it. And certainly this non-dual tantric tradition only started to vaguely emerge after he passed away. Would he have embraced it when it came out? We'll say yes. Right. But and also, so what Rudy saw was tens of thousands of Westerners flocking to India to become spiritual, putting on orange robes, shaving their head, right, yada yada yada, right. And he realized, of course, that there was no real depth happening there. It was just a shift from, from the hippie days to that, and so what he was concerned about, what was important to him, because he had been going to India for a long time. He met Nityananda in 1959. Was that what should have been happening, and this it's not that this didn't happen for some people or maybe many people, was the extraction of the content and not the container. So he was not interested in chanting. He was not interested in studying a lot of scripture, etc. Because he had a very clear message. It is your own direct inner experience that's real. So my point is that I didn't study scripture for a long, long time. As it began to bubble up, then a little here, a little there, but it really was only about 20 years ago that I began to really study it, and began to understand the extraordinary pearls of wisdom that is available to us through Scripture. You can read 100 pages of Scripture, and on the 99th page, when you're about to put it down, saying, okay, then there's one line. God is love. There's one revelation that becomes available to us. The point being is that Scripture does provide for us teachings, wisdom, what are called wisdom teachings. Maybe it's even the book by some teacher you might know, right? Does provide insight. And sometimes it provides insight that we don't know we're receiving. And then something dawns on it, that the energy of that teaching reveals something. It's important that we understand that triadic nexus of knowing, right? Again, it kind of rotates, right? And there are periods in your life when you might need to study more. There may be periods in your life where you might need your teacher less. I don't think there's ever a period where you do less meditation. And probably what happens is the more we meditate, the more we might recognize that what that bullshit teacher was telling us all along was true. Or what that scripture was suggesting might be true. So it was amazing to see this happening and see this dialogue take place, right? Because it was an affirmation of what we were talking about yesterday, that one of the choices we are able to make, and unfortunately a choice we don't often make, is to love our life. And to love God. And each of our lives is happening from within us. It is never, ever, never gonna be happening to us. It happens from the field of our own consciousness. Possessing the central power. We can say consciousness. We've discussed that svatantriya, this autonomous power, not different. Replete with the flood of all the feeling states existing within. Beautiful with the universal joy arising from essence, nature, stimulated by innate desire. Such a beautiful way of expressing that this power to express is that the expression is happening out of the universal joy, and that innate desire is the intent to express that joy. You exist because of the universal joy's innate desire to express. Whoa! Just close your eyes. Let that sink in. And as I've said to you so many times, if that's why we exist, then shouldn't that be our choice? Shouldn't we, you can open your eyes, shouldn't we be choosing joy? Shouldn't we be penetrating through non-joy to find that joy? Shouldn't that be the purpose of our life, is to live in that joy? And therefore, shouldn't that be the discipline of our life, to use the tools, to use our own consciousness, to use our teacher, to use our community, to use the people that we love, to bring us back to that remembrance, to remember this is the purpose of my life, the joy of my own being. This is what it means to love our life. And in doing so, we're loving God. In doing so, we are living the union of Shiva and Shakti. We are an individuated expression of that divine love. And we could get really erotic around that discussion, couldn't we? This intimacy between Shiva and Shakti. But lest silly people start talking about bodies and souls. Right? How beautiful. I really, OMG, I'm so excited. And I'm deeply grateful for Hadish and Ben. The moment they discovered this, they shared it. There are some scholars who would not have shared this and would have charged lots of money, written, volumes of book about it and released it and says, you want to buy it? It's going to cost you lots of money. I got it. You don't have it. I deeply respect what they're doing. So we're going to stop now, and I'm going to guide you through a meditation. This is a meditation that I gave last week that I want to give again, because I want to. People ask me actually to do it again. I've called this Samavesha meditation. Samavesha is a Sanskrit term that incredibly can be translated in two different ways. Penetration into or absorption by. The dynamic interchange between consciousness and consciousness doubling back on itself. So at once we're using our awareness to try to penetrate into our essence nature, And at the same time, we're trying to allow ourselves to be absorbed into that essence nature. So that's the meditation we'll do. So please close your eyes. And just become aware of your breath. And just keep your breath settled. And just let your awareness be centered in the breath. And just notice the arising and subsiding of the breath from your center. And as you follow the arising and subsiding of the breath, at the end of the out-breath, let go. As you follow the arising and subsiding of the breath, and at the end of the out-breath, as you let go, notice that the center, the openness in your heart opens more. Let go. And And just notice how you're more centered in the openness. The breath becomes subtle, and if you will, in the background. Let the openness and the centeredness of your awareness just open, because the breath arises and subsides from it and within it. Just keep your awareness and use your own awareness to touch your own heart. You'll notice that the breath becomes even more subtle. And that the arising and subsiding is really the pulsation of consciousness. Keeping your breath subtle. Use your own awareness to touch the still point from which the breath arises, the still point from which consciousness arises and subsides back into that still point. Each time you come back to that still point, let go. Each time you come back to that still point, let go, and then let go again. Just feel that simple, still openness. Use your own awareness to remain in contact with that stillness. If your mind flares, just bring your awareness back to your breath. Use the breath to direct the energy of your awareness to touch the center of the heart again. Just use the energy of your awareness to subtly penetrate into the center of the openness. Make contact with a deeper place. And let go. And as you sit and reside in that openness, feel that that openness, that consciousness within you is engulfing you, absorbing you. Let go. Let go again. Just remain in contact with that fullness. Let yourself be absorbed by that fullness. Let that fullness engulf you. That fullness is the vibrating resonance of the heart of consciousness. Today we learned that Scripture says that that vibrating presence is divine love. Let yourself be absorbed by that love. Remain in contact with that fullness. Feel it in your heart. Feel it in your body. They're not separate. As you move through your day, as you move through the world, move from the heart. Move from that divine love. Move from that pure presence. As you open your eyes and move through the world, move from that presence, and you'll see that everyone that you see wears the face of God. So we'll take a break now. I guess we'll make it 20 minutes because everybody needs to go pee and make their tea and all that stuff. So 20 minutes from whatever time your clock says now. And we're back from downtown Berkeley. So I'll stop there for a moment and see if anyone would like to ask a question about our discussions or about the meditation. Okay, I guess we have no questions. Okay, and turn your book to page 13. Okay, go ahead. Say what? Please hold that for a little later discussion, if that's okay. The question that came up was about tattvas, which is a discussion of the levels of consciousness, of which there are 37. But I'll perhaps come back to that. I don't want to move into that discussion at the moment. So please turn your books to page 13. We've been discussing the darshan as a view of non-dual practices. And I've said a few times that teachings are not real until we make them real. And as we discussed this morning, those teachings of which scripture is certainly a means of discourse, a means of teaching, is an important part of our coming to our own innate knowing. But as we also said, it really is our own direct experience that makes that real. And so the discussion I want to have with you for a bit is the practices, the means for making the wisdom of expounded in Darshana real to us. So this page 13. Okay, so then just so we're clear, then all of the discussion around the practices and the means I'm within non-dual tantric practices, particularly within our practice, is I'm discussing within the practice of Kundalini sadhana, within the practice of the awakening and liberation of Kundalini. The awakening and liberation of Kundalini, which is an individuated expression of consciousness, to know that it is that same pure consciousness from which it was emoted. And so what is discussed within the Tantric tradition are called means, which means path or ways, right? And within that, there are correlating practices within each of these means. Means, the Sanskrit term is upayas, right? Tantric tradition talks about 4 upayas, 4 means. The highest means is called anupaya, which means no means. By no means. If you will, the spontaneous, immediate recognition of our own essence nature by God. That immediate awakening, and in that awakening, no further means are required. So we can also describe anupai as no further means, right? The other means are, in one way you can understand that they are the progression to lead us to that point where no other means are necessary. I won't get into an elaboration, but one of the discussions that we've had is that anupaya can also be understood as pratibha. Pratibha means the flooding of insight. Our intuition is part of the dynamics of that insight. But pratibha, if you will, in its highest understanding, is the flooding of insight, the being engulfed by pure awareness and the recognition, the direct experience and the direct recognition that we are that same pure consciousness. As Rudy would say to us, that's great. The rest of us schmucks have something to do, have some work to do. So when we talk about the expansion of our consciousness, the changing of our consciousness, we talked earlier that really it is that longing that arises when God sends us the email that says, "Come home." It is that wish to change our consciousness that it drives all of our efforts, all of our understanding. But it is the practices, so the wish to grow, the wish to change our consciousness must translate into actually changing our consciousness, making that change. Unless God just wipes us clean, we're pure water now, then we have to use some filtering device to clean out the impurities of misunderstanding. So that's what we'll talk about for a while. And so you can see on this page, the middle of it, it says, in the means and practices of Kundalini sadhana, the sadhaka penetrates into the dimensions of the central channel, becoming one with Shiva, the source and holders of the power of the universe. Now, this is a very emphatic statement that it is, Kundalini sadhana is, in fact, the penetration into the channeling of our life force and our awareness and our will into the psychic body, into the central channel. There are practices and traditions that don't talk specifically about Kundalini. I only know one thing, and that's Kundalini, right? I have never to be honest, never needed to know anything about other practices, because the 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 unfolding of my own movement into freedom has started and has always been propelled by that awakening of Kundalini that happened when I met my teacher. So I give it some credence. It's a little bit important to me. And everything that I taught, all my own practices and the practices that I teach are centered around the awakening, the liberation of Kundalini. And we've spent days and days and days correlating this discussion and trying. And so what you'll see is that in the discussion of the means to liberation, I'm correlating that with the discussion of the awakening of Kundalini, the liberation of Kundalini, the expansion of individual consciousness to universal consciousness. So if you look towards the bottom of the page, you'll see a little table there that lays out these other three means. So we said anupaya means no means. Then there are three others that really are incredible in their articulation of the experience of moving from duality into non-duality, of the experience of moving from of being closed to open, of living in tension to living in joy. Now these upayas are always taught from the highest to the lowest. So if you go to your far right, the little box that says Shambhavapaya means the path of awareness. So you come into a room, you meet a guru, you meet a teacher, they look into your eyes, bada bing, bada boom, that flooding of insight, that flooding of awareness just engulfs you, and you recognize your true state. It's discussed as the path of awareness, understanding that it is the path of energy that normally brings us to that point, but it could be the transmission of Shakti, the transmission of awareness from that embodied vehicle that brings us to that point. This is not, this is an uncommon experience. While that isn't to say that we may get a taste of that. We may get a whiff of it. We may have a short momentary being absorbed by it, and that full awareness showing itself. This happens, I think, for a lot of people when they come in contact with whatever tradition, whatever teacher, whatever dynamic that longing brought them to. But that's part of the grace that we get a glimpse. We get a sneak preview, right? This is what is true. And for most of us, unfortunately, we quote, fall out of that. One of the really beautiful ways to understand upayas is that it's twofold. The upayas really represent, quote, the stage that we find ourselves in, represent the degree of recognition of our own Shivahood, the degree of recognition that we are that pure essence. That pratibha we talked about is just, the full Monty, kabam. This direct recognition, I am God, I am Shiva, I am pure consciousness, I am love, right? And it's so intense that it dissolves all misunderstanding. It dissolves all impurity. It dissolves all separation, all suffering of I'm separate from God. The recognition, not only I'm not separate from God, I'm God. Man, I'm a pretty bad dude, right? So one of the ways that we understand the upayas is depending on the intensity of grace, is the intensity of the revelation, the recognition of our true nature. So we can say that Shambhavapaya is one notch below Pratibha, but it's a pretty high experience for those of us who are interested in high experiences. It is this recognition that's so strong, so profound, that we can reside in that awareness. We don't fall out of it. So the upayas are a way that tradition, the ancient script practices and teachers have been able to be able to recognize, if you will, the state of awareness of the person who comes in their door. In fact, there are some discussions in some of the scripture that says that's the first thing the guru should do. Diagnostic. Well, okay, so does she 1 to 10, scale of 1 to 10? Well, she's an 11. I gotta be careful. That's right. Right. The purpose of that discussion, of course, is to say that then the teacher, the guru, then gives the person the practices that are relevant to their state of awareness. So the highest practice a guru might give somebody, they come in, they're a scale and diagnostic 1 to 10, and they're a 9, maybe all it takes is a single word. A single instruction, a single glance to move them from 9 to 10. If a person comes in and let's say they're kind of Raptu type for New Orleans, they run the diagnostics, and let's say let's be fair and say it's a 2, bordering on maybe a 1, right? Then a single word, a single glance, probably, to some degree, depending on the depth of surrender and agency of the guru serving God, but most likely that single glance isn't enough to fully awaken that revelation, to bring that person to 10. So it would be a disservice, if you want to think of it like that, to just, you are God. You are God. Don't bother me. You're God. Now go figure it out what it means, all right? So there is but okay, relax everybody. I don't do that. There's not an entrance exam, right? To be honest, I rely on the intrinsic intelligence of the Shakti and the energy to run the diagnostic and to, if you will, to deliver what it needs to deliver. When I do open eyes transmission, I'm not sitting there, measuring, this person, opening that person. I'm surrendering to the best of my ability to allow the energy and the awareness that is moving through me to make that, to discern that, and to, if you will, to give what is necessary. Because otherwise, then it's it's an ego trip, and it's me. It would be me getting in the way. Now, okay, I am often informed of a particular level of consciousness. We'll call it that, right? But you'll all probably see that I don't then begin to discriminate between giving the fundamental basic meditation and the most advanced. My experience is you give them all. The level of capacity for receptivity within the student determines which one is the most, has the most efficacy for that person. And so I've been very careful not to insert my own measurement of quote students. I let God make that discernment. A much higher intelligence than me is doing the work, if I get out of the way. So this discussion of the upayas is a suggestion, though, that depending on that state of revelation, depending on our own recognition of our own essence, that determines, if you will, the stage of our realization, and determines where we start from in the progression of the expansion of our own freedom, where we start from in the progression of the awakening, the activation of the awakening and the liberation of Kundalini. So if you look at the chart, the next one down is called Shaktopaya, called the path of energy, often discussed as also the path of knowledge, which we'll talk a little bit about. And Anavopaya, which is the path of effort. I will say that what the upayas are described as a non-linear progression, meaning, okay, the diagnostic, God runs the diagnostic, you're a one, and he says, you shall make an effort. Right? The practices and the revelation that's available to us in the path of effort, path of individual effort, can bring us to the highest state of realization. It's nonlinear. Now, I think the reality is that it's at least a progression, right? That there is some linearity to it. My experience in myself, my experience in working with and supporting students is that there is a progression. There is a starting point of openness, that can expand into unbounded openness. There's a starting point from contracted awareness into a little bit less contracted, and then on the scale it goes from, at some point it goes from being contracted measurement by contraction to a measurement by openness. Right? On that scale of 1 to 10, if the upayas are linear that way, we'll say that 5 is the middle point where we stop dealing with contraction and start dealing with openness. Hey, that's pretty good. Never thought about it like that. Right? I said earlier, we were talking about the way back home, and I talked about opening your heart, contacting the power of the heart or center, and residing in that center. That's another way of discussing these upayas, where we're talking about the degree of openness, the degree of awareness that's revealing itself as we make contact with the heart. And if we start from our own heart and we connect and feel God's heart, and then we are absorbed by God's heart. I used that language because it is the heart of consciousness. It is God's heart that all sadhana is trying to bring us to. So you'll see under this chart, we'll go back to, we'll just accept for the day that we're all a one. Oh, no, I don't want to be a one. You can't tell me I'm a one. Right? How dare you? Just accept it for the next 5 hours. Because I'll say this, sports fans, that sometimes we might find ourselves in an exalted state, and the next moment we might find ourselves in not such an exalted state. We're revving up, man, we're moving from 7 to 8 to 9, oh, I'm almost ready, and all of a sudden we're back to a 1. Most often determined by what? Conditions. Most often determined by and controlled by our need to control. Conditions. And when conditions are groovy, it's easy to be a 9, right? But it shows the thinness of our own consciousness, that we cannot reside in that pure consciousness in the face of challenge, in the face of adversity, in the face of something that absolutely is out of our control. And yet, we allow that, we choose to allow that dynamic that's out of our control to dictate our state. So what my point in saying that is that that's why you can understand that these upayas are, that even in our highest state, residing in pure consciousness, perhaps there is even an effort being made by there, or perhaps to remain in contact, to remain engulfed in that consciousness, we might have to make an effort. We may have to take a breath, right? So we're going to assume we're all a one and move forward. Now you'll see underneath this, in this table, there are these 3 boxes are converted into 6 boxes. And this is the way that I, along with many of the acharyas that I've initiated, have tried to express the specificity in more specific terms these upayas, and then to correlate the particular practices, the particular revelation that takes place within us along those. So it says, an anavapaya, the path of effort, open your heart. We've been talking about this all weekend. What I think the first thing that our discussion reiterates for us is that opening our heart is always a choice. Closing our heart is always a choice. And so there's lots of discussion around anavapaya. It's often discussed within tradition as doing ritual, as doing seva, as, if you will, doing in the world. And I certainly wouldn't discount that at all. You know, I'm a gigantic proponent of seva, in case you don't know that. We can discuss seva, which is simply helping somebody to get something done that they need to get done, all the way to the ultimate serving of freedom, which is how I would describe service in Shambhavapaya. But the point being is that in the correlation of the upayas and anavapaya and making an effort and opening the heart and correlating that with the practice of Kundalini sadhana, the first thing we must do in the practice of Kundalini sadhana is to open our heart, to take our awareness, to take our life force, to take this prana and turn it inside, to internalize. The three levels of Kundalini are prana Kundalini, right, the breath and our life force, Chitta Kundalini, the energy and awareness of our mental and emotional faculties, but mostly of our individuated consciousness, and Para Kundalini, the energy of our spiritual self. The liberation of Kundalini that we're talking about is the liberation of the deepest core of our spiritual self, Para, being liberated from misunderstanding. Lest silly people start talking about bodies and souls. But the point being is that in a major way, based on the teachings that I received from Rudy, the experience that I had with Rudy, right? I emphasize that the foundational practice has to be that we open our heart. And that is an internal dynamic, an internal effort. And it's an effort to open our heart instead of fall into the prison of fear and doubt of mind and emotion and ego. Instead of reacting to the world and closing because we can't control what's happening there. So this field of openness that we want to establish ourselves, it becomes then the foundation of which we build our spiritual home on. It's also, from a, quote, a technical point of view, how we internalize our awareness, how we internalize our energy and direct it to the base of the spine and facilitate or create the possibility of directing it to the doorway into the central channel. So Rudy's double breath that we practice is emphatically talking about taking all of our awareness, taking the energy of our awareness, taking our energy and our awareness, if you will, out of the world, connecting it to our breath, and opening the heart. Rudy always talked about the muscles of the heart, right? The psychic muscles of the heart. And so we open our heart, we tune our awareness inside, we gather that up, we let some sense of understanding and simplicity and openness there, and then we take another breath and we move it into the belly. We move it into the navel chakra. We're creating an openness, a channel for the externalized energy of our life to be able to be directed towards the internalized dynamic of our life, which is the central channel. So it says there, open your heart, and then it says, open your heart and feel the flow. This ancient teaching given to us in 1971 by our guru, right, is I think the most important teaching that I have ever received. I think it's the most important teaching that could ever be given. I think we could even discuss talking about a Navapaya and opening the heart as the highest practice. But we'll at least acquiesce and say, okay, it's the foundational practice. It is the primordial practice of turning our awareness inside and developing the capacity to establish ourselves in the heart. And to be able to then engage with the world, to engage with our mental world, to engage with our mental world from that open heart, and to use our engagement with those things to actually open the heart. So if you turn your page to page 14, okay. In continuing our discussion of correlating with the COVID practice, COVID requirements, it says heart no distancing. There's 3 people in the room here. They're about 15 feet apart, right? There's conflicting theory now, whether it's 6 feet or 10 feet. They're being really safe and saying, okay, I'll take 15, right? But our hearts are together. Yeah. There is never, ever any distance between you and your heart. There may be an experience of you and your heart being millions of miles away from each other. That's the experience of closeness. That's the experience when we've allowed whatever dynamics, internal or external, to externalize our energy. To externalize our energy out of the core of our consciousness. To externalize our energy out of the depth of consciousness, and to begin to energize the mental and emotional fluctuations, to energize the ego, to reinforce those dynamics. And so, as we did during the meditation, as we'll continue to talk, when we talk about opening the heart, one of the important dynamics that we're talking about is when we find ourselves losing contact with our heart, when we find ourselves being ravaged by the mind, obliterated by our own emotions, being pulled on somewhere on the other side of Pluto by our fears of the world. We are consciously choosing to extract the energy that's feeding those particular places where our consciousness has gone and internalize it, bring it back out of the mind, back out of the emotions, back out of the fears of what's going to happen to me in this world, and using that same energy to open our heart. And it's like lifting weights. We're developing the muscle capacity to open our heart in the face of all adversity, in the face of all challenge, whether it's our own internal duality that's creating this dynamic, or the quote apparent duality of the world. Don't practice distancing from your own heart. Don't practice distancing from your heart and the heart of the people you love. We're sitting here in this room. There's people wonderfully all over the planet tuning into us, and there's no distance between us. So it says here, Anavopaya, the path of effort, is the internalization of energy and awareness. It's the opening the channel for the internalization of prana. Prana is our life force. The foundational practice in Kundalini sadhana is the internalization of prana. So it says here, underneath these two hearts that are breaking the rules and not doing distancing. It says, in the course of our sadhana, we are immersed in an ongoing cyclical practice of becoming inwardly absorbed, extending from that absorption, expressing that into action, and folding the energy of that interaction back inside. That's what we call flow. we are centered in our heart and function from that inner still point, we can make conscious choices by pulling back into the heart before we act. We are taking our own life force, our power of action that we extend out into the world, and we're repeatedly folding it back in again, extending it back out, and folding it back in again. We understand action as a discernible energy, and instead of projecting it outside, we establish a flow, an interchange with life. An interchange with life, which generates a dynamic power that we can use as fuel. By no longer projecting it outward, it is available as a potent force that can power the ascent and expansion of our own consciousness. The understanding, the capacity, excuse me, I got to put a little more Shakti juice in my eyes. You guys don't know this is where it all comes from. I think we can all admit that to some degree or the other, we engage in the practice of not practicing. We engage in the practice of reaching and grasping outside of ourselves. Which isn't in no way to suggest that we shouldn't have a dynamic interchange with our life. But so much of the time what happens is because we're perpetually reaching for, grasping for, projecting towards, then what we're really doing is depleting our own life force. We're perpetually extending it out and extending it out until at some point there's so little of our own life force inside of us that our experience becomes the world only. So it's important that we understand that it is the foundational practice of taking our awareness and taking a breath and pulling our awareness inside and finding the heart and opening the heart and beginning to take all that energy that we were projecting out and, if you will, fueling or nourishing, massaging the heart so that it can begin to breathe. It can begin to have a pulse. Thank you so much, Rishi. And so what we're talking about is truly, not theory, not a nice idea, not something we do when it's convenient. Choosing every day to open our heart. Choosing every day to connect to a deeper intelligence, a deeper awareness in ourselves. Choosing every day, refusing every day to live in contraction. And I won't suggest to you that that's always or necessarily easy. In fact, a great master called Kashe Maharaj, who was part of the Tantric tradition, made this statement. He says, the innermost essence, which is one's own pure, pervasive, present, that the innermost essence, which is one's own pure, pervasive, present consciousness everywhere, that is the life in all living beings, can be attained by sadhana. Although it is difficult to reach and hard to attain by undisciplined souls. Our innermost essence, the life of all beings, can be attained by sadhana, although it is difficult to reach and hard to attain by undisciplined souls. This suggests to us, this is a person who lived in the 12th century, 13th century. Excuse me for not being exact about that. That all of the idea that we have that modern life is what's made life so hard and why we can't live in our side, etc., is frankly bullshit. That 1,000 years ago, there was as many excuses, there was as many rationales, there was as many reasons why we didn't live in ourselves as that we have now. The only difference is we have computers to tally up the total a lot faster now because there's so many more of them. Oh, it's my cell phone, or oh, it's this, or oh, it's that, or oh, it's this, right? Rudy said it so beautifully. Everything is a reason to be open. Nothing is a reason to be closed. The Navapaya, and the reason I read that quote, the path of effort can be most importantly understood as the practice of developing the discipline of our sadhana, developing the discipline of opening our heart, developing the discipline of meditating regularly. Everybody raise their hands that meditates 4 times a day. Everybody put your hands down that you're, well, nobody put their hand up. Okay, I got it. Everybody that meditates 3 times a day, raise their hand. 2 times a day. No fudging. No 1.5 hands. No halfway up hands. 1 time a day. Everybody that's in a state of meditation all day, raise both hands. Everybody who are sequestered, cocooned at home, and only meditate for 30 minutes or less, raise your hand. I wish we had Zoom so we could all see each other. Right? Isn't it amazing? We can't go anywhere. I can't go play tennis. I'm pissed off about that, right? Of course, the joke that I had with my friend James, who I play tennis with, who beats me regularly, is that I've been having all these visualized matches, and I win every time. So there's some value in that, right? Isn't it amazing? We're being asked to stop our lives. The little video we showed the other night was so beautiful. She's thanking the virus for making us stop. My question to each of us is, how much time in the middle of that stop are we truly spending internalizing our own awareness, using the opportunity to discover a deeper clarity? The point being is that Anavopaya is the foundational means, because it is the means in which we develop the discipline of sadhana. And if we, back to our scale, or happen to be a 1 instead of a 10, then moving through the progression of the expansion of our own consciousness cannot happen without that foundational discipline. We started as a 1. God made us a 1. You're a 1. And while that grace is ever present, it's not like God makes us a 1 and then watches us flounder around like a fish out of water for 20 years and says, okay, I'll make you an 8. Right? The development of our consciousness in every level is a developed consciousness. It is a spiritual home, to use White Eagle's terms, that is built on a solid foundation, and that solid foundation is discipline. Not just the discipline of meditating ever how many times a day, but the discipline of perpetually reaching inside to connect to a deeper consciousness. That's the discipline we're after. Okay, here's what we'll do. I'm going to issue you all the 30-day challenge. There's all these 30-day challenges going on. Don't eat beans for 30 days, dance for 30 days, whatever. Here's my 30-day challenge to all of you. Ready? Meditate twice a day for 40 minutes or more. And I'll be watching you. You can accept the challenge or not. What's 30 days from today? March 5th? March 5th? We're not going backwards, Rudra. We're not regressing for 30 days. We'd like to do that and start over with this, how we're managing the COVID, right? So on March 5th, May 5th, some date in the future, 30 days from now, sit down, make yourself a cup of tea, and be honest with yourself. How much time did you choose to invest in finding God in your heart? And I mean specifically, how much time did you sit down on your cushion, turn off your cell phone, and just go inside? There are brownie points available to everyone. And I will allow you to decide your own integrity, your own honesty. And if you wish, you can send me an email on May 5th and testify, ask for forgiveness. We can go to confessional. And then I can say, okay, do 50 Hail Marys and start all over. There's bonus points available to you if you choose to meditate for 40 minutes more times a day. Perhaps the bonus point might be that at the end of that period, and whatever class I might teach that's on that date or after, you might receive something different. We have a little mouse running around in the meditation room, just loving this Shakti. When Sodashi and I first moved to Berkeley, we lived across the street. And after being there for a while, we had this little mouse that showed up. And the first thing we did was try to, because if you see one mouse, there's supposed to be 50. So, we said, okay, we should get rid of the mouse. So the first thing we did was I went out and I bought one of those catch and release traps. Put a little cheese in it, right. Next morning come, and what I noticed is that this mouse was at least spending most of his time up on the altar next to the little statue of Rudy that I have. And he was eating the rice from the incense, so we changed the rice, it made it rocks, this thing, but there was little droppings there, so he was clearly spending time there. So I put the trap there in the afternoon, evening. The next morning, I go in and I look, and I can see what's in there. So I'm all excited. So does she look? I caught her. So I walk back into the kitchen, and I open it up, and the mouse jumps off and runs back into the living room. Shows my level of consciousness. We try all kinds of things to catch the mouse. Catch and release, he said, hey, think I'm stupid? I ain't going back in there, right? We put out peanut butter, we did this. He would eat the peanut butter off the trap, leaving the trap. I super glued the peanut butter in the rice to the trap, and he didn't eat it. He would just get little parts of it. The trap never would kill him. So this is probably the moral of the story, the good thing about the story, right? But finally I decided, look, okay, it's Rudy's friend. He wants to be near Rudy. Who am I to disengage? So we decided, fine. So back in the day there, we had 8, 10, maybe 10 or 15 people who came to class, and we taught in the living room. And so one night I come in, I'm sitting there, and I believe that it was Sambati's first class. Her name was Dana back then. Came and sat in class, and she's sitting down in front of me here. And we're in open eyes class, and then all of a sudden this little mouse comes up next to her, sits up, hands are like this, and just sits there looking at me. And she's trying to keep her attention on me. And meanwhile, the mouse just sits there. And he finally runs off. I don't know why I'm telling that story. I can't remember. Oh, there was a mouse running around here like in the shock day. Okay, but it was a good place to to break into. Uh, to end our discussion on, and so we'll take our break, and we'll come back at 2:30, and then we'll continue. We'll see if you want to ask some questions about that, but. So connect to your heart. There is no distance between you and your heart. There is no distance between your heart and God's heart. This is, from my perspective, the highest of all teachings. When it says there, Shambhavapaya, reside in consciousness, we're talking about residing in the heart of consciousness. So a Navapaya is the foundational practice. And there's never a moment where that capacity, that discipline, is not necessary. That discipline will and should mature into ease. But that's for a different discussion for the moment. Let's stop and close our eyes for a couple minutes.